We survived the mission. That was our real crime. I speak these words in a chamber that smells of old incense and colder stone, the lumen above me flickering in a nervous rhythm that keeps throwing my shadow across the wall like some restless spirit. A wheezing Vox recorder sits on the table, its machine spirit muttering through static, its red rune blinking every time it captures my breath. I do not know who will hear this confession, if anyone. I only know the words must be spoken at least once, even if the truth dies the moment this tape does. The room is small, bare, unadorned, a place where forgotten men speak quietly and are unremembered more quietly still. I can taste dust on the air, mixed with the metallic tang of old oil and the faint ghost of promethium leaking from some cracked fuel line deeper in the outpost. The Emperor's worlds run on fumes and faith. On days like these, I suspect it is mostly fumes. I was a sergeant of the Astra Militarum. Once, that meant something. It meant standing between my men and the abyss. It meant shaping fear into obedience, obedience into resolve. But now the rank sits on me like a relic pulled from a ruin, cold, corroded, half lost to time. I have carried many burdens in war, none weighed as heavily as the order that ended us. The world where it happened was a trench world long before we reached it. Generations had fought and bled across its face, layering the soil with burnt offerings of flesh and ash. The sky was a constant bruise of smoke and drifting soot, and every breath tasted like rust scraped from the inside of old helmets. Our trenches filled with fog at dawn and corpses by dusk, and the cycle never changed no matter how many prayers we whispered into the dark. I remember the soundscape most clearly, artillery groaning like ancient beasts awakening, the rattle of lasfire carried on winds heavy with chemical stink, the mutter of men trying to make their hearts beat quietly under flak armor, and, beneath it all, the low hum of faith, whispered litanies, the brushing of charms against armor plates, the soft click of rosary beads. We clung to ritual because the world gave us nothing else firm to hold. In those days before the mission, I thought I understood the shape of duty. I believed the Emperor measured sacrifice by intention, that a clean death in his name was a kind of absolution. I believed the Imperium did not waste its soldiers without purpose. I believed many things then. I did not yet understand how knowledge can damn a man faster than any Xenos toxin, or how obedience can be sharpened into a blade turned inward. What I remember most is the quiet dread before everything broke, a sense subtle as a shift in the wind that the ground under us was changing, that the fog rolling through the trenches carried whispers we were not meant to hear. At the time I thought it was fatigue, or imagination, or the usual ghosts a soldier invents to fill the silence between bombardments. We didn't know we were already dead. That is the truth of it. Before the final order, before the betrayal, before the digging out of forbidden echoes in that cursed ruin, we were marked. Not by disobedience, not by corruption, but by accident, by a mission no one should have survived. When I close my eyes now, I still see the faces of the men who trusted me then. Their shapes move through the fog of memory like figures caught between life and judgment. I did not yet know how many of them I would personally send to the Emperor's side, nor that their belief in me would be the last weapon raised against them. If there is mercy in this galaxy, it is hidden well. We went into that mission as soldiers. We came out as liabilities. And I, Emperor help me, lived long enough to understand why. The trenches shaped us long before the mission damned us. In those narrow warrens of mud and rusted plating, a man learned the worth of the souls beside him, not by their medals or prayers, but by how they moved when the shells fell, how they breathed when fear thickened the air. My squad was small, but their presence filled every corner of my memory like lanterns flickering in the dark. Merrick was the first of them, my second, my balance, my quiet mirror. He was the kind of soldier the Guard tries to manufacture by doctrine but rarely succeeds in forming. His armor fit him like ritual vestments, every strap tightened, every buckle checked twice. Even when the trench walls wept with rain and chemical frost, his boots somehow found the driest path. Discipline radiated from him the way heat radiates from reactor cores, steady, unwavering, dangerous only to those who did not respect it. In the dim light of the trench lamps, I often caught sight of him adjusting another trooper's chest plate or quietly correcting a grip on a las gun without humiliation. He steadied men by existing. We never spoke of fear, but I learned to recognize it in him, not in his eyes, but in the way he smoked. When battles dragged too long, he rationed each pull like a man holding back a confession. I used to imagine he would outlive all of us, standing firm long after the rest of the regiment became names etched on memorial slates. I was wrong in every way a man can be wrong. Jalen was younger than he had any right to be. His armor still carried the sheen of new ceramite under the grime, and he smiled with a kind of hesitant hope that had no place in trenches like ours. He followed me like a shadow made of earnestness, mimicking my posture, my prayers, even the way I checked the seals on my gauntlets. He once told me he wanted to be a sergeant someday, like you, sir, as if the universe allowed such aspirations without cost. He carved a small Aquila charm from scrap metal one frostbitten night, hands shaking from cold and nerves. He offered it to me without ceremony, cheeks flushed red beneath the grime. When I held that uneven, clumsily shaped thing, I felt something close to fear because I knew he believed in me more than he believed in himself, and because I sensed I would not deserve it for long. I still feel the rough edges of that charm in my palm, though it has long since been confiscated, burned, or lost. Then there was Voss, loud, brash, swearing his way through terror as though volume alone could keep death at bay. He carried a heavy weapon that had survived more wars than any of us, its barrel scarred and sanctified, purity seals fluttering like tattered feathers. He laughed at danger because silence scared him more. When the bombardments hit too close, I sometimes caught him whispering quick prayers into the gun's grip, as if its machine spirit might answer with courage. Voss carried stories the way some men carry wounds hidden until the moment they needed to be revealed. Around the fire pits, he regaled the squad with exaggerated tales of past battles, making even the despair around us feel momentarily distant. But when the night grew too quiet, when the lamps flickered, and the wind dragged through the wire like a dying choir, he trembled. I once promised him, in a rare moment between barrages, that I would never let him die alone in the mud. I believed that promise when I spoke it. I didn't understand the kind of death awaiting us. Together, they made the trenches bearable. We shared recaf that tasted of tin, divided ration bars into unequal pieces so Jalen could eat more, and let Voss's jokes stitch small wounds in our hearts back together. Merrick kept us steady, Jalen kept us human, and Voss kept us from drowning in our own dread. In those fragile nights between assaults, we listened to the distant crackle of the Vox, half prayers, half static. Men across the world cried out commands or litanies lost to interference, and sometimes, beneath it all, I could swear I heard echoes that didn't belong to any human throat. We thought it was just the warped, distorted bleed of distant units. We were wrong. But we didn't yet know how wrong. I believed my role was to protect them. I believed the Emperor asked nothing more of me than to lead them with a steady hand and an honest heart. But the truth was already moving toward us like a shadow across the trenches. Their trust in me would become the blade placed in my hand. Their faith would be the reason that blade struck true. We were still laughing then, still living, still ignorant of the order that would turn all that loyalty to ash. The mission was given to us without ceremony, without the usual litanies or hollow speeches about valor. A junior officer delivered it with stiff shoulders and eyes that refused to meet mine, as though the parchment in his hands carried a sickness he feared might leap onto him. Behind him stood a Ministorum adept, robes clinging damply to his frame, censer smoke leaking from the seams of his sleeves as if his nerves had ignited the incense within. He spoke no blessing. That should have been the first omen. The orders were simple on the surface. Advance beyond the established trench line, cross no man's land under cover of fog, and investigate a structural anomaly uncovered by recent bombardment. But each line of text was stamped with sigils I didn't recognize, rosettes infused with authority so absolute they made my skin tighten beneath my armor. I had seen Inquisition seals before, in briefings where commanders whispered and priests trembled, but the marks on this parchment were older, heavier, like relics exhumed from a vault no one wanted to admit existed. We set out before dawn, when the world was little more than shifting grey shapes, and the sky pressed low enough to smother sound. The mud clung to our boots like pleading hands, and the fog draped itself over us, swallowing our outlines until even Merrick at my side became a wraith. Every few meters, Jalen tapped his lasgun against his chest plate as if checking it was still real. Voss muttered curses into the handles of his heavy weapon, promising it more kills if it just behaved long enough to get him through the morning. As we crossed the wire, something changed in the air. The smell of sulfur and decay was replaced by something faintly metallic like blood dried centuries ago, ground to powder and stirred by unseen winds. I felt it settle on my tongue, coating it with a taste that made my heart beat slower. Even the distant thunder of artillery seemed muffled, like we were walking into a pocket of silence carved out of the world. The anomaly revealed itself as a half-collapsed structure buried under layers of churned earth. At first I thought it was Xenos work, angular, wrong, humming faintly with a resonance that made my teeth ache. But as we drew closer, the shapes resolved into something impossible. Imperial stonework, Imperial script. Imperial iconography, older than any cathedral I had ever seen, etched into the exposed walls as if the earth had tried to swallow a secret and failed. A doorway yawned open, broken by shellfire. Blue light pulsed faintly within, like the dying heartbeat of some ancient beast. "Emperor, guard us," Merrick whispered, not in fear, but in recognition. Inside, the air was cold enough to sting. Our breath formed smoke around us, drifting in slow, unnatural spirals. The stone under our boots was carved with reliefs that shouldn't have existed, depictions of imperial unity before the age of apostasy, figures speaking to crowds without halos, without divine radiance, and at the center of the chamber stood a cracked hollow emitter, still functional enough to cast a wavering image. A tall, regal figure appeared cloaked in light, face stern but unmistakably human. No crown, no divine aura, no godhood written into his frame, only authority, worn like armor. The voice that followed was distorted by time, but the message was clear enough to freeze every drop of blood in my veins. There shall be no shrines, no worship, no false divinity in my name. Voss dropped to his knees. Jalen made a sound like a wounded animal. Merrick's breath hitched, then steadied through sheer will. For a moment, none of us moved. The hollow flickered, the chamber groaned, and then the entire place shuddered, as if rejecting our presence. I barked orders without thinking, dragging the men back toward the lightless doorway just before a second tremor shook the structure, collapsing part of the ceiling. We fled into the grey dawn, stumbling over rubble and wires, our breaths ragged. Behind us, the ruin sealed itself beneath a wave of falling stone and dirt, as though the world wanted to bury the truth again. The others spoke little. They thought it a hallucination, a psychotrick, a leftover echo of some heretical cult. They wanted to forget it before the sun rose. But the Imperium does not rely on hope or coincidence. It knows the weight of a truth too heavy to be carried by mortal hands. It knows what must be done when knowledge threatens faith. We did not understand it then, but the moment we stepped out of that ruin, we were no longer soldiers. We were loose ends. After the mission, the trenches felt different, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to collapse. The fog still rolled in at dawn, thick and cold, but it no longer felt like weather. It felt like a veil drawn between us and the rest of the regiment, a wall of silence so dense that even sound seemed afraid to cross. We returned to our lines expecting reprimands or debriefings, but none came. Instead, officers watched us from a distance, their eyes sliding away the moment any of us looked back. I remember the stink of wet soil rising around us as we climbed down into the trench, boots sinking into the muck with familiar squelches. But the usual greetings were absent. No one clapped Voss on the shoulder. No one asked Jalen about his latest carved charm. No one waved Merrick over for tactical updates. The men of other squads shifted aside, forming small gaps in the narrow walkway as if we carried something contagious. For a time, we pretended not to notice. Soldiers learn early to swallow discomfort the way they swallow fear, quietly, without complaint. But the silence pressed on us until even the lamps above seemed dimmer. Merrick tried to act as though nothing was wrong. checking gear, assigning watches, performing the rituals of routine with the sharp efficiency he always carried. But I saw the tension in the set of his jaw, in the way he cleaned his weapon twice that evening without realizing he was doing it. We gathered near a fading heater unit, sharing rations that tasted of stale oil and metal. Voss poked at his mush with the tip of a trench knife, muttering that even corpse starch had more flavor than whatever they'd given us. Jalen forced a laugh, but it cracked in the middle. He kept glancing toward the command dugouts, where officers passed hunched and whispering under dripping tarp awnings. "Sergeant," Jalen said finally, voice low enough that I almost didn't hear him over the hum of the heater. "What we saw, it wasn't real, right? It was some kind of Xenos trick. Some illusion." His hands trembled as he spoke, the Aquila charm around his neck catching the weak light with each tremor. I wanted to lie again to give him simple certainty. But the echo of that hollow voice still pulsed inside my skull, every word as clear as if it had been carved into my bones. Before I could answer, a Vox unit crackled behind us. Not with orders, those came sharply, cleanly, but with a distorted loop of sound, faint and warped, like a voice speaking through waterlogged circuits. "Not meant to see. Not meant to see." The phrase repeated until a nearby officer snapped at the Vox operator to shut the channel down. The static died, but the whisper lingered. Voss tried to laugh it off. "Probably some poor bastard's last words. Drifting through the lines," he said, but his voice faltered, and the bravado didn't hide the fear tightening around his eyes. Later, when the lamps dimmed and the trenches settled into their usual nocturnal quiet, I walked the line alone. I passed by priests clutching incense burners like shields, their chants shorter than usual, strained. One glanced up at me and immediately looked away, as though my presence risked some spiritual contamination. Further down, a commissar stepped into a dugout the moment he saw me coming, closing the door with unnecessary force. Officers spoke in low, hurried tones whenever any of us walked near, ending conversations mid-sentence. Something had changed, something we didn't yet have a name for. On second watch, Merrick approached me. He kept his gaze fixed forward, hands clasped behind his back, like a man reporting for discipline. "Sir," he murmured, "they're avoiding us. The clergy, the officers, even the commissars. They look at us like we crawled out of a plague pit." I nodded. "I've noticed." "What does it mean?" The truth hovered on the edge of my tongue, but I didn't yet understand enough to speak it. I only knew one thing clearly. The ruin had shown us a fragment of something buried for a reason, and the Imperium does not fear Xenos illusions, it fears contradictions. "We hold position," I said. "We follow orders. Nothing more." He accepted that with a curt nod, though doubt darkened his expression. Merrick trusted me. He always had. That trust would soon be tested in ways neither of us was ready to face. Before dawn, another strange signal rolled through the Vox lines. A long pulse, a hiss, then a soft repetition. "You were not meant." It faded before the phrase finished, but by then, we already understood enough. We had brought something back from that ruin, something the Imperium could not allow to live. The truth unraveled slowly at first, like a frayed thread drawn from a tapestry no one dared admit was rotting. It began with whispers not among the rank and file, but among those who walked above us in cleaner coats and safer corridors. Officers drifted in and out of command dugouts with haunted eyes, clutching data slates already half-wiped by trembling hands. Priests carried incense burners so full their fumes stung the air, as if smoke alone could drown out an idea. We weren't told anything directly. No one ever tells the guard the truth. But truth has a way of leaking, even through stone and sanctified lies. On the second night, I found a scrap of parchment near the comms tent burnt around the edges, sigils half melted, but legible enough. It spoke of pre-Heresy doctrine, archival restrictions, and non-compliant testimonies. The words meant nothing to most soldiers. To me, they felt like a blade pressed quietly to the throat. Pre-Heresy doctrine wasn't irrelevance. It was forbidden archaeology. It was history locked behind, seals only the Inquisition dared touch. Later, I saw a tech adept being escorted off-world by 2 stormtroopers. His mechadendrites twitched as though trying to reach back towards something left behind. His mask turned briefly toward me as he passed. I couldn't tell if the look was pity or warning. Either way, the message was clear. Whatever we had uncovered, the Mechanicus wanted no part in cleaning it. Voss found a broken servitor that same day, its skull split open, cogitator cores smashed by a blunt instrument. He called me over before anyone else saw it. The poor thing's tongue still twitched with residual charge, spitting out half-formed syllables. No God, no God. Before I could shut it down, an overseer dragged it away, muttering that it had suffered corruption. Voss and I shared a look that needed no words. That night, as the fog draped the trenches in pale grey shrouds, I caught a glimpse through a gap in a tarp, 2 men arguing in a low, vicious whisper. One wore a junior officer's sash, the other the black coat of a commissarial adjutant. Their words came sharp between hisses of incense smoke. It cannot be released. Even a fragment, but if they speak of it, if the men compare what they heard, then all must be silenced. That is how doctrine survives. I stayed in the shadows until they passed, their boots splashing through mud thick as brewed blood. Only when the fog swallowed them did I exhale. The next morning brought the first undeniable sign. A data slate was recovered from the ruins, cracked, pulsing faintly with residual warp static. It took 3 tech priests to access its final stored image. They tried to conceal the result, but a reflection in a broken Auspex lens revealed enough for me to glimpse it. A holo mural, not of a saint, not of a god, of a leader tall, stern, luminous, not with divinity, but with intellect and will. His hands raised, not in benediction but in command. And below that figure, etched clearly in high Gothic script, "No shrines shall be built in my name. No man shall bow to me. I am no god." The technicians shut the slate down immediately. One began reciting binary prayers so fast his vocoder glitched. Another whispered that the echo was a trick of the ruin, a hallucination, a warp distortion, anything but what it truly was. But I had heard the same decree in that chamber, felt the weight of it pulse through stone and air, seen the echo of a time before holy lies grew roots deep enough to choke a galaxy. The Emperor had spoken once, long before we were born, and he had forbid worship. I carried that truth in my chest like a live ember, too hot to hold, too dangerous to drop. Jalen approached me later, eyes red-rimmed with sleeplessness. "Sergeant," he whispered, "if what we saw was real, does that mean the priests are wrong?" His voice broke on the last word. Fear twisted his features into something, small and fragile. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Some things," I said softly, "are not meant to be questioned." The lie tasted like ash. He nodded. He wanted to believe me. Emperor help him, he did. Merrick found me afterward. He didn't ask questions. He only said, "Whatever this is, it's bigger than us." I looked at him. "It is bigger than everyone." He held my gaze a long moment, then turned back to the men. He knew we were marked. He didn't say it. He didn't need to. By nightfall, everyone in the regiment felt the shift. Not through words, but through distance. Officers no longer approached us. Priests finished litanies in half the usual time, refusing to sprinkle us with sanctified oils. Commissars observed us with the cold precision of surgeons deciding which limb must be amputated. Jalen clutched his Aquila charm as if it could erase memory. Voss kept his gun close, as though the weight of it grounded him. Merrick watched the officers with narrowed eyes, calculating outcomes. And I understood, finally, the shape of our doom. The Emperor had not lied, but the Imperium had, and now we knew. The inquisitorial commissar arrived at dusk, when the trenches resembled open graves and the sky sagged under its own weight. A cold wind carried the stink of burnt oil and distant bombardments, making the devotional parchments nailed along the trench walls flutter like dying moths. I sensed his presence before I saw him, the way conversations thinned to silence, the way men stepped instinctively aside, the way even the fog seemed to recoil. He descended the trench ladder with slow, precise movements, boots clicking against the metal rungs like executioners' bells. His coat was a depthless black, stitched with crimson thread that glimmered faintly under the guttering lamps. The rosette on his chest, a stylized eye framed in the wings of the Aquila, was the kind of authority that didn't need to be spoken aloud. We had all seen commissars before. This was something colder, something older. Commissar Marvin Luthrex. The name carried through the trench on a dozen whispering lips before anyone dared say it aloud. He moved past the men without acknowledgement, eyes sweeping over us not like a commander reviewing soldiers, but like an archivist inspecting damaged records. There was no interest, no curiosity, only assessment. I knew, with the same certainty I reserved for incoming artillery, that he had come because of what we saw. He reached the command dugout and disappeared behind the reinforced curtain. Officers followed him in 3 captains, a priest, the senior Vox officer, and none emerged for nearly an hour. Their muffled voices leaked into the trench like poison gas. I tried not to listen. I failed. If they speak of it, the faith fractures. Containment must be absolute. Witnesses? All of them. A pause. Then you understand the mandate. The priest protested, soft, trembling. They are loyal men, faithful men. Silence. Then Luthrex's voice, level as stone. Faith is irrelevant once contradiction is heard. I felt the cold trench floor sway beneath my feet. The universe narrowed to a single, sickening realization. Knowledge was the heresy. Knowledge was the corruption. Knowledge, not action, had marked us. When they finally summoned me, I felt the eyes of the entire trench on my back. I stepped inside the dugout and found Luthrex alone, seated behind a crude field desk. A single lumen hung overhead, flickering like a hesitant heartbeat. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply gestured for me to stand before him. His face was sharp, severe, carved with lines that suggested he had never once smiled in his life. His eyes were black as cooling, obsidian, reflective, depthless, unblinking. "Sergeant," he said, "your squad survived an encounter that should have left no survivors. No accusation, just fact." I held my posture steady. "We followed orders. We returned intact." "Precisely," he replied, "and now something must be corrected." He opened a data slate and turned it toward me. It displayed our regiment's name, my men's names, beneath a stamped decree I had never seen before. Exterminatus Memoria Regiment Designate, Silio 9, all personnel to be purged for doctrinal contamination. No survivors permitted. Execute by dawn. My throat closed. The dugout felt suddenly starved of air. The dim lumen swayed slightly, its light carving deep shadows into the commissar's gaunt cheeks. "Sir," I managed, "we are loyal. He cut me off with a raised finger, not a gesture of anger, a gesture of finality. "Loyalty is irrelevant. You saw what the Imperium cannot allow to exist. You heard what must never be repeated. This is not judgment, Sergeant. This is maintenance." He stood then, coat whispering around him like the wings of carrion birds circling a battlefield. "You will carry out the order," he said, quietly, efficiently. My heart pounded like artillery in my ears. "What order?" His gaze did not waver. "The regiment must destroy itself by dawn." The words hit harder than any shell. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I felt mud, fog, and all the years of service compress into a single point in my chest, sharp enough to break bone. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to something coldly intimate. "If you refuse," he said, "the Inquisition will do it instead. And trust me, Sergeant, your men will beg for your mercy long before they face ours." I wanted to speak, to argue, to scream. But the words died in my throat. Duty, loyalty, faith, these concepts had always guided me. Now they twisted together like a rope tightening around my neck. Luthrex dismissed me with a flick of his hand, as though sealing the fate of my entire regiment was as simple as clearing dust from a table. As I stepped back into the trench, the fog clung to my faceplate, cold and heavy, like a shroud already settling over us. Merrick straightened when he saw me. Jalen rose from where he'd been polishing his lasgun. Voss gave me a half grin, waiting for my next order. I looked at them and felt something inside me. Fracture. They trusted me. They were waiting for their sergeant. And I had just been ordered to murder them all before dawn. I walked back into the trench, as though I were descending into a crypt I had dug with my own hands. The fog hung low, muffling sound and softening the outlines of men who had followed me through storms of fire and nights without stars. Their shapes moved in the half-light like phantoms unaware, unburdened, still alive in their quiet ignorance. The order pressed against my skull with every step. The regiment must destroy itself by dawn. Merrick noticed the change in me first. He always did. He looked up from where he knelt beside a wounded trooper, tightening a tourniquet with clinical calm. His eyes narrowed, ever so slightly, reading the tension in my shoulders, the way my hand hovered near my sidearm. A silent question hung between us. I turned away before he could voice it. The men gathered around a dying heater unit, its faint glow illuminating faces lined by smoke and sleeplessness. Voss sat cross-legged on a crate, heavy weapon laid across his lap like a child he was afraid to set down. He tapped its casing with the back of his knuckles, a ritual he performed whenever he felt the world edging too close. Jalen perched beside him, hunched forward, elbows on his knees, whispering some half-remembered prayer under his breath. "You're back," Voss said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "What did the brass say? Finally sending us somewhere warm?" The chuckle that followed was brittle, cracking at the edges. Jalen looked at me with open hope, pure, unguarded, painful to behold. I felt the words tightening in my throat, too heavy to swallow, too lethal to speak. Merrick joined us quietly. "New orders?" he asked. I tried to steady my breathing. The scent of burnt promethium drifted on the cold wind, mixing with the sour tang of wet earth. Somewhere behind us, a Vox operator coughed weakly, static echoing in his throat as his failing unit cycled through broken frequencies. No one spoke. They were waiting. I forced the lie out. "We hold position for now." Merrick studied me a moment longer, his gaze searching for fractures. I kept my expression as still as the trench walls. Eventually, he nodded and returned to the fire, though I saw the doubt flicker across his features like the shadow of an unseen shell bursting far away. Jalen edged closer to me. "Sergeant, did the commissar say anything about the ruin?" His voice was quiet, hopeful, afraid. "About what we saw?" I forced my jaw to unclench. "It was nothing. A trick of the place. Forget it." He swallowed hard. "I've been trying." His sincerity twisted inside me like a blade. Voss snorted, though the humor in it was thin. "See, told you all it was warp madness, probably breathing recycled air too long, or maybe the Emperor was telling us to get our heads checked." The laugh he offered afterward was small, almost childlike. For a moment, I thought I might break. The sight of them alive, trusting, warming their hands around a heater that barely glowed, unraveled something in my chest. I excused myself. I told them I needed to check the perimeter. They believed me, of course. They always had. The trench pathway twisted in narrow, suffocating turns. Water pooled in every depression, reflecting the flickering lamps like sickly stars drowned in mud. I leaned against the chilled rockcrete wall, breath fogging the air, and pressed a hand over my face. I had led these men through ambushes, bombardments, countercharges. I had watched them bleed and patched them up. I had stood between them and death more times than I could count. Now I had to lead them into death with my own hands. I thought of Merrick, whose steadiness had anchored me more than he ever realized. I thought of Jalen's devotion, fragile, earnest, undeserved. I thought of Voss's laughter echoing across cratered ground, masking the tremble in his fingers. I felt their trust wrapping around my throat like a noose. The night deepened. Somewhere, a distant artillery piece roared its final salvo. The ground trembled. The lamps buzzed. The air grew colder still. And in the fog-thick silence of the trench, with the order rotting inside me like a buried secret, I understood the cost of obedience. Duty had always demanded blood, but this was the first time it demanded their hearts instead of mine. Night in the trenches carried a different weight after the order. The fog thickened until it pressed against the skin like damp cloth, and the lamps overhead flickered in long, uneven breaths, as though the machine spirits sensed what approached. My men slept in shifts, huddled figures, wrapped in torn greatcoats and faith. Trusting the night to hold steady, I should have been among them, saving strength for dawn. Instead, I moved like a ghost through the narrow passages, each step sinking into mud that clung stubbornly to my boots, as if trying to pull me down. I needed answers. Not the official kind delivered from gun barrels and signatures. The truth behind the truth, the kind whispered in back rooms, the kind that made commissars lower their voices. If I was expected to kill my own regiment, I would at least know why. The command trenches were thinly guarded at this hour. Officers rarely patrolled at night. The dark held too many shapes for their comfort. I slipped past a pair of sentries who barely glanced up, their eyes rimmed with exhaustion, their minds dulled by long hours and ration wine. A hanging tarp marked the edge of the command dugouts. Beyond it, I stepped into a deeper gloom that smelled of incense, static, and fear. The first thing I heard was a voice, low, clipped, precise. "Commissar Luthrex. Containment is already compromised," he said. "Information spreads even when not spoken. Memory itself is the threat." Another voice answered a captain's, trembling beneath a thin veneer of composure. "They're good soldiers, loyal. They don't understand what they saw." "Understanding is irrelevant," Luthrex replied. "Exposure is enough." I edged closer to the slit in the canvas, careful not to disturb it. Inside, Luthrex stood beside a map table illuminated by a single lumen orb. His face looked carved from stone, shadows cutting deep lines across his eyes. Two captains and a priest hovered nearby like chastened children. "The Emperor's divinity," Luthrex continued, "is a foundation. Unquestioned, unbroken. It is not a matter of belief. It is a matter of necessity. If soldiers begin to wonder what he intended or what he forbade," the priest swallowed loudly. "But surely knowledge of ancient doctrine." Luthrex silenced him with a look. "You want purity? Then understand purity must sometimes be purchased with blood." Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. A Vox unit crackled from a corner of the room, spitting out a half-formed message. I recognized the tone before the words resolved. If survivors persist, doctrinal variance escalates. Heroic narrative to be preserved. Memory must be rewritten. My breath froze. A third voice, distant, mechanized through the Vox, delivered the verdict. All who heard the contradiction must die. The illusion must remain intact. My chest tightened until I thought the bones might crack. Illusion. The word struck harder than any order Luthrex had given me. A faint scrape echoed behind me, someone shifting. I turned silently, back pressing against the mud wall. Two priests passed, their censers spilling thick incense into the passageway. Their whispers floated through the smoke. They saw too. Some truths are not survivable. Faith must remain untouched. When their footfalls faded, I exhaled carefully and returned my attention to the dugout. Luthrex spoke again, voice colder now. "The sergeant will carry out the cull. The men trust him. They will not resist. This ensures a clean record." One captain hesitated. "And him, sir? Once the regiment is removed?" Luthrex paused. The shadows seemed to lean closer. "He will live. One survivor is needed to authenticate the official account. Without that, the story fractures." I felt the world tilt beneath me. Live, not as reward, not as mercy, but as a tool to seal the lie with a living witness. My stomach twisted. I had thought nothing could shock me after the ruin, after hearing the Emperor's denied divinity whispered in ancient echoes. But this was a different kind of horror, a bureaucratic one, a planned reshaping of truth by men who believed the myth mattered more than the reality behind it. I waited several heartbeats more, ensuring no further revelations slipped through, then stepped back into the trench corridor, fog swallowing me whole. Around the next bend, I found Jalen standing watch, lasgun held tight to his chest. His young face brightened when he saw me. "Everything all right, Sergeant?" he asked softly. I opened my mouth. The truth clawed at my ribs, desperate to be spoken. but behind his eyes was trust, faith, hope. I forced a calm I didn't feel. "All's well. Keep your guard up." He nodded, relieved, and turned back to the fog. My legs felt weak as I walked away. The truth weighed so heavily inside me that each step felt stolen. Luthrex's words echoed with every footfall. Memory must be rewritten. Illusion must remain intact. All who heard the contradiction must die. The night pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. Now I understood the real reason for the order, and at dawn, I would become the blade that carried it out. They gathered before dawn, just as the sky began its slow crawl from black to the sickly iron grey that passed for morning on that trench world. The fog was so dense it clung to the skin like sweat, filling lungs with cold moisture that tasted faintly of rust. A bell clanged twice from the command line, short, clipped, official. It wasn't the alarm for bombardment or deployment. It was the signal for purification rites. The men accepted it without suspicion. Soldiers are used to rituals they don't understand. When an order comes wrapped in incense and silence, they bow their heads and obey. They lined up along the central trench, boots sinking into mud that swallowed every step with a wet sigh. Helmets tucked under their arms, weapons unloaded, hands clasped behind their backs in the posture of inspection. They looked like a regiment standing proud for a commendation, not for slaughter. Merrick approached me first, as he always had when orders were unclear. His breath smoked in the cold air, and a sheen of frost clung to the edges of his armor. "Sergeant," he murmured, voice steady. "Whatever this is, we'll face it. Together." His certainty cut deeper than any accusation. Behind him, Jalen fidgeted with the Aquila charm around his neck, trying not to show the tremble in his hands. Voss leaned on his heavy weapon like a pillar, pretending calm, though the mud around his boots bore witness to his shifting weight. A priest moved through the line, swinging a censer that exhaled heavy incense. The smoke mingled with the fog until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. He avoided my eyes. I knew why now. The first group was called forward 10 men, helmets presented, chins lifted, expressions expectant. They thought this was purification, a check for psychic contamination, a prayer, a formality. They trusted me to lead them through it. Luthrex stood behind me on a raised firing step, hands clasped behind his back, posture immaculate. The black of his coat seemed to drink the light around him. When he spoke, it was not loud, but it carried through the trench like a blade sliding free of its sheath. "Commence." My stomach turned to iron. My breath froze in my throat. For a moment, I thought my legs would refuse to move, but the men watched me, Jalen with hope, Merrick with faith, Voss with the quiet expectation that I would keep my promise. I lifted my last pistol. The fog muffled sound, but I could still hear the quiet intake of breath from the first soldier, in line a sound of confusion, not fear. He didn't understand. None of them did. They stood at ease, shoulders squared, trusting, always trusting. "Sergeant?" he whispered. I fired. The shot flared red in the haze, cutting through the fog like a dying star. The man dropped instantly, collapsing into the mud with a dull, wet impact. The next few seconds felt suspended, no wind, no sound, no breath, before reality slammed back into place. Jalen gasped. Voss flinched. Merrick's eyes snapped toward mine, shock rippling beneath his discipline. But none of them moved. Not to resist, not to run. They waited for orders. My orders. Luthrex's voice came low behind me. "Continue." I raised the pistol again. It felt heavier now, as if the weight of every name, every memory, every moment of shared laughter had been poured into the weapon's frame. The second man looked me in the eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't plead. He only nodded once, obedience unto death, and I fired again. A third, a fourth, a fifth. The air filled with the smell of cauterized flesh and scorched cloth, drifting with the incense in a nauseating mixture of holiness and death. Blood pooled in the mud at my boots, dark and spreading. Voss let out a shaky breath. "Emperor, Emperor, help us." His voice cracked on the second invocation. Jalen stepped forward, eyes wide, face pale. "Sergeant," he whispered, "what's happening? Why are we?" I couldn't answer him. If I spoke, I would break, and breaking would mean they died afraid, so I kept firing. The fog swallowed the screams, the trench swallowed the bodies, and I swallowed the last pieces of myself with every pull of the trigger. When the first row was gone, the second stepped forward willingly, still trusting, still believing this was a test, a rite, an act of faith. Merrick placed a steadying hand on one trooper's shoulder, guiding him into position despite the horror in his eyes. He knew what was happening. He didn't question it. Orders were orders, and I was their sergeant. One by one, they fell. I kept my face still, my hand steady, my heart silent, until the last man in that group collapsed, and the fog drifted over their bodies like a benediction denied. The betrayal had begun, and dawn was still hours away. The trench felt smaller as the killing went on its walls, pressing inward, the fog thickening until the world shrank to world. Nothing but faces I loved and the gun that would end them. Dawn crept closer in thin ashen light, each minute bleeding into the next with the same slow inevitability as a heartbeat fading to stillness. The regiment assembled in segments, trusting, obedient, unaware that they were walking into the final chapter of their own names. When Merrick stepped forward, the fog parted around him like it recognized a man who deserved more than this. His armor bore fresh scratches from our last patrol, and frost clung to the rims of his pauldrons. He stopped 3 paces in front of me, boots sinking into the red-brown mud. His breath smoked in slow, measured clouds. He studied, my face really studied it, and in that long moment of silence, I knew he'd pieced it together. He saw the truth, the fatigue in my shoulders, the tremor in my grip, the absence of hope. Instead of fear, there was acceptance. He straightened, clicked his heels together, and brought his hand up in a crisp salute. Not for appearances, not for protocol. For me. I flinched, barely, but he held the salute with quiet dignity, lowering it only when he was ready. His voice was steady when he spoke his last words, not a prayer, not a plea, simply ritual, orders acknowledged. My vision blurred around the edges, but I raised the pistol anyway. He kept his eyes open as I fired. No flinch, no hesitation. He died as he lived, serving the chain of command, even when it turned against him. His body folded into the mud, and the scent of burnt cloth mixed with cold morning air. I stepped over him carefully, as though one stray touch might break me. The next in line was Jalen. He walked forward with slow, uncertain steps, fingers worrying the aquila at his neck. His lips trembled as he tried to form words. When he stopped in front of me, he looked smaller than he ever had, like the trenches had finally stripped the last pieces of childhood from him. "Sergeant," he whispered, "did we do good?" The question stabbed through me with a pain deeper than any blade. I wanted to tell him everything, that he had fought bravely, that he deserved life, that he should have lived long enough to forget these trenches. But lies were all I had left to give. "Yes," I managed. "You did good." His eyes filled with relief, pure, fragile, radiant. He closed them and bowed his head. I fired. He dropped to his knees first, then forward, the charm slipping from his fingers and landing in the mud with a soft splash. I couldn't bear to pick it up. Voss was next. He approached, dragging his heavy weapon behind him, boots dragging through the muck, shoulders trembling. His bravado had been stripped away like rotten bark, leaving only the terrified man beneath. When he reached me, he tried to smile. The expression faltered almost immediately. Guess this is it, huh?" His breath shivered. "Front row seats? In the Emperor's Hall?" The joke broke halfway through. He wiped at his eyes with a muddy sleeve. "You promised, Sergeant. You said you'd get me home." I felt my heart claw against my ribs. "I know." He nodded, jaw trembling, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. Just don't let me run. I don't want to run." "You won't," I said softly. He closed his eyes, his shoulders relaxed. I shot him in the chest, aiming clean, quick. He fell backward, weapon sliding from his hands. The fog swallowed him before the mud did. One by one, Squad by squad, the regiment stepped forward. Some whispered prayers, some stared into the fog with empty eyes, some nodded to me, trusting I knew the purpose they did not. None resisted. The trench floor grew slick with blood and runoff, bodies forming dark mounds that the fog curled around like mourning shrouds. The air filled with the smell of burning cloth, sanctified oils, and the bitter sting of last discharge. Incense smoke lingered, as if the priest's censer had tried to sanctify the massacre and failed. By the time the last of them fell, my arm had gone numb, fingers stiff around the pistol grip. The dawn finally reached the trench in full, bathing the dead in grey light. I stood alone among my brothers, surrounded by silence so heavy it bowed my spine. We had destroyed ourselves, and I had led the way. When the last of my brothers lay cooling in the mud, silence settled over the trench like a burial shroud. Dawn crept upward, pale and sickly, its light filtering through the fog in thin shafts that illuminated the bodies scattered along the firing line. Their armor caught the dim glow in broken reflections, scratches, scorch marks, dried blood, all of it shimmering faintly as if refusing to let the light claim them. The world felt emptied, gutted, hollowed out to make space for the guilt that pressed itself into my chest with every shallow breath. I walked among them slowly, each step sinking into a mixture of mud, frost, and the dark. Stain of men I had sworn to protect. Merrick's body lay closest. He had fallen with a soldier's grace, straight-backed even in death, his face turned slightly toward the rising light, eyes half closed as though waiting for a final order I never gave. I knelt beside him, gloved fingers brushing the back of his gauntlet. His hand was cold, stiffening. I had seen countless bodies on countless worlds, but this one struck like a hammer blow. Not because he was dead, but because I had been the instrument. Further down I found Jalen. He had fallen forward, one hand still clutching his Aquila charm. The metal glinted weakly, wet with dew and blood, its edges caked with dirt. He looked young. He had always looked young. Even beneath grime and fear, he held that faint promise of innocence the trenches had not yet managed to strip away. I reached for the charm, then stopped. I had no right to touch it. My shadow fell over him, and the fog curled around his form as if trying to hide him from what I had become. Voss lay sprawled across a patch of churned earth, his heavy weapon half buried beneath him. The recoil burns on his gloves were still visible. His face was twisted, not in fear, but in the pain of someone whose life ended with a broken promise. The fog drifted across his open eyes until they became pale mirrors of the sky above. I closed them gently. I don't know how long I wandered through that graveyard of my own making. Minutes, hours, time dilated, stretched thin like skin over bone. The trench lamps flickered overhead, buzzing with the same weary fatigue that filled me. Somewhere, distant artillery rumbled, detached, indifferent, like a heartbeat that no longer belonged to this place. Eventually, I felt movement behind me. I turned slowly, instinct dulled, senses numb. Commissar Luthrex stood on the firing step, rigid as a statue carved from black stone. His coat was immaculate, untouched by mud. The rising light caught the edges of his rosette, casting a tenbow, faint crimson glow across the fog. His voice was low, controlled. "The regiment's duty is complete." I did not answer. My throat felt carved from ash. My hands shook not from cold, but from the memory of each pull of the trigger. "You have one final task," he continued, descending into the trench with precise steps. "The process must be completed." I knew what he meant. The pistol at my hip felt suddenly heavy, as though it sensed the purpose for which it was raised. I drew it slowly. The motion felt distant, like watching another man's hand move in front of me. I walked toward an empty section of the trench, one untouched by bodies, a place where I could kneel without stepping on the fallen. The fog thinned slightly here, revealing the jagged outlines of the trench wall. I lowered myself onto my knees, the cold seeping through my armor, grounding me. For a moment, everything stilled. No wind, no voices, no sound except my breath, slow and hollow, echoing through my helmet. I thought of my men, Merrick's steady calm, Jalen's fragile hope, Voss's laughter hiding fear. Their faces played behind my eyes like a final, flickering hollow recording. I raised the pistol to my temple. A faint tremor passed through my arm. Memory flooded in the ruin. The forbidden truth. The ancient voice declaring its rejection of godhood. I wondered, briefly, if the Emperor would recognize me at the moment of my death, or if he had forgotten us long ago. My finger tightened on the trigger, then a hand gripped my wrist. Luthrex's voice was quiet, almost gentle. Not yet. His words froze me more completely than the cold morning air. I turned toward him, confusion hollowing my breath. His expression did not change. "If you die now," he said, "your regiment will die as heretics. Their families will be punished, their honor erased." The weight of his next words crushed what little remained of me. "If you live, their record stands. They will be remembered as heroes. Their kin will be spared." The fog swirled around us, cold and silent. "Choose, Sergeant." The pistol shook in my hand. I chose. The pistol lowered in my shaking hand, but not by my will, only by the gravity of Luthrex's words settling over me like a shroud. The fog drifted through the trench in slow, mournful currents, curling around the bodies of my regiment, dimming their faces until they looked like shadows receding from memory. I knelt among them, breath misting in the cold air, my arm trembling from exhaustion, guilt, and the weight of a decision no soldier should ever be asked to make. Luthrex stood over me, boots planted firmly in the mud, as though he were immune to the rot and sorrow that clung to the ground. His voice remained calm, level, as if reciting an inventory list rather than offering me damnation disguised as mercy. "You live," he said, "and their legacy lives. You die, and every man who fell this morning becomes a traitor. Their families suffer. Their children are marked for purging." He let the words linger sharp, clinical, final. I looked past him, toward the line of my fallen brothers. The fog clung to Merrick's armor like a mourning veil. Jalen's hand still lay curled around the Aquila charm in the mud. Vos's heavy weapon gleamed faintly in the weak daylight, its barrel darkened by dried blood and powder. They deserved better than this grave of fog and lies. "You planned this," I whispered, voice cracking. "From the moment we returned." Luthrex didn't deny it. "From the moment you survived," he corrected. "The Imperium has no place for soldiers who glimpse contradictions." A cold wind cut through the trench then, biting through my armor, carrying the taste of ash and sanctified oils. I understood, in a hollow and terrible way, that he wasn't speaking as a monster or a tyrant. He was speaking as a servant of a machine that devoured truth to preserve its own shape. "Stand," Luthrex ordered quietly. My legs obeyed out of habit more than strength. I rose slowly, boots sinking deep into the mud, pistol limp in my grasp. My limbs felt as though they belonged to another man, a puppet performing the final motions of duty. Dawn's light crept over the trench wall, revealing the scale of the slaughter in pale, merciless detail. Luthrex approached me, stopping only inches away. His eyes were devoid of malice or pity. They held only purpose. "You will be reassigned," he said. "Your survival will be explained in the official account. You escaped the final blast. Your men fell sanctifying a heretical site." His voice took on the cadence of ritual. "They will be honored." My stomach twisted. "And the truth?" He leaned forward, so close I could smell the cold leather of his coat and the bitter tang of incense woven into its lining. "The truth," he said, "is irrelevant. Truth bends, legacy does not." I felt something inside me snap quietly, soundlessly like a bone giving way under pressure. I thought of Jalen's shining eyes, of Voss's laughter masking fear, of Merrick's steady presence. I thought of how they had followed me into fire without question. "They trusted me," I whispered. Luthrex's voice softened in a way I wished it hadn't. "That is why they obeyed. That is why this worked." My hands trembled again, but this time with anger layered beneath the grief. "You used their faith. I used what the Imperium built into them," he replied. "Duty, obedience, sacrifice. These are not sins, Sergeant. They are foundations." He gestured to the corpses lying in silent rows. Your men died loyal. That loyalty must now be protected by lies. That is the price. The fog drifted through the trench again, thicker than before, swirling around my boots. It felt like the world itself recoiling from what had happened. Luthrex turned away, already finished with me. The transport arrives within the hour. Clean yourself. Remove their blood from your armor. The living must not carry the dead into their next assignment. I stood frozen, the pistol slipping from my fingers and sinking into the mud with a muted thud. Luthrex climbed the firing step and disappeared into the fog, leaving me alone with the dead and the choice that would haunt me long after the trench world was swallowed by war. Live, and they remain heroes. Die, and they become traitors. There was no honor in the choice, no solace. Only a burden I could not refuse. I knelt one last time beside Merrick, Jalen, Voss. I pressed my gloved hand to the mud over their chests, whispering a vow meant for no ears but theirs. I will carry this. The fog curled around me like a grip tightening, and I lived. The transport that took me from the trench world felt less like a vessel and more like a coffin with engines. Its metal frame groaned under every atmospheric shift, and its interior stank of rust, oil, and antiseptic, incense, an attempt to mask the scent of death that clung to my armor. No matter how long I scrubbed it. I sat alone on a bench meant for a full squad, hands clasped, helmet resting beside me like a skull stripped of identity. Each time the engines rumbled, I imagined the sound was Merrick's steady breathing, Voss's nervous tapping, Jalen's quiet questions, ghosts filling empty seats. They reassigned me to a fortress outpost on a nameless world, a place where the sky never cleared and the walls were built not for glory, but for forgetting. The stone corridors echoed with the hum of reactors and the distant chant of servitors reciting monotonous litanies. No one asked about the bloodstains in the creases of my armor. No one asked why my eyes lingered on every squad that marched past, counting them, comparing their movements to those I had lost. In the training yards, new recruits performed drills with fresh zeal, unaware of how quickly zeal could be reshaped into silence. There, boots struck the ground in unison, a sound that once brought me pride but now twisted inside me like a dull blade. I corrected their stances mechanically, spoke the expected lines, gave the expected nods. But every motion felt hollow, as though I were playing the role of a soldier carved from old stone. The outpost's chapel was small, lit by flickering candles that cast shadows taller than the saints carved into the walls. I visited often not to pray, but to sit beneath those silent figures and wonder which version of the Emperor they represented. The one we had been ordered to worship? Or the one whose voice whispered through ancient ruins, rejecting the divinity thrust upon him? The candles smelled of tallow and sanctified oils. Their smoke drifted upward in slow spirals, reminding me of the fog that had carried my brother's last breaths away. Sometimes, during supply inspections, I found crates stamped with our old regiment's insignia. A clawed wing, a rising blade, the sight of it struck harder than any weapon. The clerks logged them as salvaged material, their history erased with a few keystrokes. One day, I found a uniform patch with Merrick's handwriting still faintly visible along the inner seam, his initials stitched neatly, precisely. I closed my fist around it until the edges cut like glass, then hid it beneath my bedding, a relic for a man who was no longer allowed to exist. The official records spoke clearly. Silio 9 Regiment destroyed in heroic action against heretics. All personnel died purging a corrupted site. One survivor escaped the cataclysm. Meritorious conduct noted. A lie carved into stone, a lie sanctified. The truth shivered in the marrow of my bones with every step I took. I walked patrol routes at night, when the outpost grew quiet, and the only sound was the whirring of surveillance servitors. The air tasted of dust and machine oil, not the wet soil and promethium fumes of the trench world, yet sometimes I swore I could hear the distant echo of lass fire cutting through fog. Sometimes I turned corners expecting to find Voss sitting with his gun, muttering curses at its stubborn machine spirit. Sometimes I reached for a second in command who wasn't there, forgetting Merrick was now just another shape buried beneath the weight of my orders. The world around me moved forward. Duty continued. The Imperium churned on. But I remained static, a fragment of a memory that should have been purged, a witness preserved only to uphold a lie. The worst moments came not in battle drills or long marches, but in the quiet hours before dawn. That was when the outpost lights dimmed, casting the bunkroom into a grey half-light that too closely resembled the fog of the trenches. I would sit awake while the others slept, listening to the familiar hum of machinery, feeling the cold seep into my bones, and I would see their faces, all of them, not as corpses, but as they were before, breathing, waiting, trusting. There was no prayer for such moments, no litany written for the last man who remembers what should never be recalled. In the reports, my survival was an administrative necessity. In the truth, it was a sentence. I lived, and with every passing day, the weight of that choice grew heavier until it felt less like memory and more like chains binding me to the ghosts of those I failed. The confession began the night the outpost lamps failed one by one, flickering into darkness until only a few glowed, pale and stuttering, along the corridor outside my quarters. The machine spirits were restless, or perhaps they sensed the weight I had carried too long. The silence of the place pressed in with suffocating intent, the kind that makes a man fear his own heartbeat. I sat at the edge of my bunk, armor stripped away, uniform hanging loose on a frame worn thinner by sleeplessness and regret. The Vox recorder rested on the table before me, an old model with cracked casing and a faint scent of burnt circuits. I found it earlier that day while sorting through a crate of salvaged gear, no designation, no identification, only a red activation rune flickering like a dying ember. It felt appropriate. I told myself I picked it up by chance, but the truth is simpler. I needed something to listen, even if it was a machine, something that would bear witness without judgment, something to prevent the last threads of memory from fraying beyond recognition. I pressed the activation rune. The recorder crackled, sputtered, then settled into a low hum. For a long time I said nothing. The weight of silence felt heavier than armor. I stared at my hands, scarred, calloused, the same hands that had pulled triggers I can never forget. They trembled slightly, as if remembering the bite of lasfire, the recoil, the steady rhythm of execution. Finally, the words pushed themselves free. I led them, I said to the empty room. I led them into the fog, and they followed me because they trusted me. That was their final mistake. The recorder captured every rasp, every pause. The air smelled of metal and old incense, remnants from the chapel lingering in my hair and clothes. Outside, a patrol passed, boots crunching softly on steel grating, voices muffled by distance. When the sound faded, the outpost returned to its quiet breathing, a low, steady hum that echoed through the walls like a great machine trying to forget its own existence. I killed Merrick, I continued. He saluted. He knew. Emperor, help me, he knew. And he accepted it. My voice cracked on the last syllable. I swallowed hard, tasting copper and old guilt. The image of Merrick's salute burned behind my eyelids, refusing to fade no matter how many nights passed between then and now. I spoke Jalen's name next, quietly, as if saying it too loudly might shatter something fragile in the room. He asked if he did good. The recorder hissed, a soft exhale of static as if even the machine understood the cruelty of that memory. I pressed my palm against my face, fingers digging into the ridges of old scars. He died believing he served the Emperor, not knowing he was dying to preserve a story built on silence. The hum of the outpost deepened briefly as a generator cycled. Shadows shifted along the walls, elongating into shapes that almost resembled the silhouettes of men standing shoulder to shoulder. Memory layered over reality until I could nearly hear Vosa's laugh muffled by tears, nearly feel Merrick's steady presence at my flank, nearly see Jalen turning his charm between nervous fingers. I killed Voss, I whispered. I promised I'd bring him home. The shame in the words felt heavier than any weapon I'd carried. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, breath fogging slightly in the cold air of the bunkroom. I obeyed, I said. I obeyed because I believed their families deserved life, because I believed their honor should not be stained by the truth buried beneath that ruin. I hesitated then, fingers tapping unconsciously against the table's slow, rhythmic beats like a distant artillery cadence. "I don't know if obedience makes me loyal," I said, "or damned." The recorder crackled again, as though it too struggled with the distinction. "To the Imperium, I am a hero who survived a sacred purge." A bitter huff of breath escaped me, not a laugh, not quite. "To myself, I am the last breath of a regiment erased by my own hand." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight inside my ribs tighten. The outpost walls seemed to lean inward, listening. The silence around me felt thick enough to break. "This confession will outlive me only if someone wants it to," I said softly. "Maybe it won't matter. Maybe it will be burned the moment it's found. But someone needs to hear their names, even if it's just the machine spirit in this recorder. Someone needs to know they lived, that they trusted me, that they walked into death with faith." The red rune blinked steadily, waiting. "I am the last man who remembers," I said. "And the memory is a wound that never closes." My voice faltered, drifting into silence. Outside, the faint sound of a distant bell marked another change of watch. Time continued. Duty continued. The Imperium continued. But I remained here, the lone witness to a truth the galaxy refused to see. The recorder's hum settled into a thin, trembling line, as if the machine's spirit itself braced for the weight of what would come next. The room felt smaller with every breath I took, its walls closing inward, pressing images of the trenches against the insides of my skull until memory and present blurred into one suffocating haze. A single lumen flickered weakly overhead, its glow pulsing like a faltering heartbeat. I sat alone in that dim chamber, hands clasped on the table before me, knuckles white against the cold metal. Outside, the fortress outpost whispered in, its sleep generators thumping, servitors chanting, distant boots echoing in hollow corridors. Life continued around me in rigid, regulated patterns. But inside this small room, time thinned until only confession remained. I could feel the truth rising, dragging itself upward through marrow and breath, demanding to be spoken even though it changed nothing, even though it condemned no one but me. "I stayed alive," I whispered, the words barely reaching the recorder. That was the final betrayal. The truth tasted like blood. It coated my tongue, thick and metallic, impossible to swallow. I stared at my reflection in the cold surface of the table, distorted, blurred, fractured. A face I did not recognize. A survivor where none should have remained. The Imperium needed one witness to uphold its myth, and I had accepted that burden with shaking hands because the alternative was worse. "I chose to live," I continued. "Not for myself, never for myself." The room felt colder. My breath fogged faintly in front of me. "If I had died," I said, "their names would have been dragged through the dirt, their families executed for imagined treason, their memories obliterated." I looked down at my hands again. They were still, too still. The hands of a man shaped by violence, now trembling under the weight of quiet. "I chose the lie," I whispered. "The lie that protects their honor, even as it destroys mine." Images surfaced: Merrick's final salute, Jalen's naive smile, Voss's forced laughter. They lingered in the air like ghosts unwilling to depart. "Every day since," I murmured, "I've carried the truth alone. No comrades to share it with, no priest I can trust, no officer I dare speak to, just memory and silence." The silence deepened, settling into the room like settling ash. "I see them," I said. "Sometimes in the fog outside the barracks, sometimes in the corners of unused corridors, sometimes in the chapel when the candles gutter out. I hear Jalen asking if he did good. I hear Voss promising he won't run. I see Merrick accepting the order before I spoke it." I closed my eyes. The darkness behind my lids was the same color as the fog that had swallowed their bodies. "The Imperium has erased them," I said. "All records cleansed, all names folded neatly into heroic myth. Only I still know what truly happened." The confession felt heavier as I neared the end. My throat tightened with words that resisted being spoken, as though saying them aloud might shatter the fragile shell that kept me tethered to sanity. I obeyed, I whispered, voice nearly gone. I obeyed because obedience was all I had left to give them. I obeyed because my death would have damned them. My eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the flickering lumen, its weak glow casting long shadows across the walls. "There is no absolution for what I've done," I said. "No prayer that fits. No scripture that forgives. The Emperor is silent. The Imperium is deaf. And I am alone." The recorder crackled softly, its red rune blinking with patient rhythm, waiting for the final words. I leaned forward, letting the last breath of confession escape me with the weight of years pressing behind it. Slowly, quietly, deliberately, I spoke the final sentence, a single solemn epitaph for a life carved from regret, duty, and ashes. I live beneath the weight of their silence, carrying the truth that buried us all.